Good morning, and welcome to lesson 56 in our study of the book of Romans. Today we're still in chapter 16, doing verses 3 through 16. And we're getting to the end of the book, and Paul is sort of wrapping up his epistle to the Romans by making note of some of the people he had met and who had served him well and with whom he had developed a relationship with, showing that he was not only an intellectual and an academician, but he was really a people person. And these were some of the people that he met and who had served him and with whom he had worked during his labors and during his time in the ministry. So he goes on in chapter 3, the first part of chapter 16, verse 3, to say, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Greet the church that is in their house." Priscilla and Aquila were a husband and a wife team who Paul first met when he was in Corinth. And they were tent makers or sail makers and tent makers, as was Paul. And so they probably got together at that time because of their professions. They had initially lived in Rome, but were driven out of Rome when the Emperor Claudius removed the Jews from the Roman city. So they came to Corinth, met Paul there, and developed a relationship with him. They went again with him as far as Ephesus on his journey back towards Rome, and they went on apparently back to Rome while he stayed in Ephesus. So this is a couple that he met and whom he knew and who had worked with him and who had labored with him and who had put out some of their own needs for his benefit. And he said he greets the church that is in their house, showing that the church that time, they had a church in their house. They may have had one in Rome, they had one previously, but now they apparently had one again in their house and when they were back in Rome. So greet the church that is in their house. Greet my beloved Ephanius, who is the first fruits of Achaia to Christ. This man is apparently the first convert to Christ in the church in Achaia, and he was remembered by Paul because of that. Greet Mary, who labored much for us. We don't know much about this woman except that she obviously was a person who worked well with Paul and who worked for Paul, and who was remembered by Paul for her sacrifices in labor. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my countrymen and my fellow prisoners, who are of note among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me. These two people were apparently, some people say they were relatives of Paul. They were kinsmen of Paul. We don't know how they were fellow prisoners or where, but they also were apparently in prison because of their love of Christ. They were noted among the apostles because of their dedication and because of their love of the Lord. So they were considered to be note among the apostles, and they were in Christ. They were apparently Christians even before Paul was. Greet Amphilus, my beloved in the Lord. Amphilus was apparently a slave name, and there's some question as to whether this was part of Caesar's household that Paul had ministered to and referred to in Philippians. Greet Urbanus, my fellow worker in Christ, and Stachys, my beloved. These were people, Urbanus was considered a Roman citizen, and Stachys was of a Greek name. These were two more that Paul knew and had worked with or had worked for. Greet Apelles, approved in Christ. Apelles means approved in Christ. Greet those who are of the household of Strobulus. Greet Herodian, my countrymen. Greet those who are of the household of Narcissus, who are in the Lord. These were all people that Paul had met and had worked with or had benefited from Paul's work, or from whom Paul had also received benefit. Astrobulus was considered a brother of Herod Agrippa I, and therefore high up in the Roman hierarchy. Herodotus was considered a kinsman of Paul, was felt to be another kinsman of Paul. Narcissus was questionably a secretary to the Emperor Claudius. So Paul's influence and the influence of the Christian church spread throughout much of the Roman Empire. Even by this time, there were people in the high echelons of the Roman society who were followers of Christ, as were people in the slave area and the poor people who also had accepted Christ and were members of the church. So Paul is greeting all of these people in a manner befitting friends and fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord. He said, greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, who have labored in the Lord. More people who have labored much in the Lord. The needs of the church were great, and these people helped. And Tryphena and Tryphosa were considered to be twins. And also the beloved Persis, who labored much in the Lord. It was felt that Persis was an older sister of Tryphena and Tryphosa. And so this was a whole family that had been laboring in the church in Rome. And it says, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. Rufus was apparently, it was felt to be by scholars, to be the son of Simon of Cyrene, the person who carried Christ's cross towards Calvary at the time of his crucifixion. Rufus was considered to be his son, and his mother was considered to be a very strong follower of Paul and of Christianity. And this is why he said, it is his mother, Rufus's mother, and mine, because she was in effect a mother to Paul in some ways. Greet Asyncritus, Philon, Hermas, Patrobas, Hermes, and his brethren who are with them. Greet Philologus and Julia, Nersus and his sister Olympus, and all the saints who were with them. So he mentions all these people in a way which is familiar, which is beneficial to him, which is very personal. And these are people who have been with him and who have helped him and who have ministered with him, who have labored with him in the work of the Lord. And he remembers them. And these people are apparently in Rome ahead of Paul, and he's remembering them all. And he's saying, these people who are accompanying Phoebe, who we referred to in the first two verses of this chapter, when these people and Phoebe who are going to Rome and apparently carrying this document, this epistle, with them, they were to greet all these people and to meet them and to associate with them and to have fellowship with them, because this was all of Paul's Christian family, and he wanted everyone to know that these people were part of his life, part of his work, and part of his future. And then he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ greet you. And this was very common in Rome in those days, as it is still today in some parts of Europe, to have a kiss on the cheek as a greeting, not a handshake or a hug, but this type of a kiss, a brotherly kiss. And this was the type of greeting that they have, and they still have in Italy and many parts of some of the parts of Europe. So this was Paul's greeting to these people. Paul's association was known with these people, and he wanted the ones who are coming with Priscilla and with Phoebe, coming with Phoebe and those accompanying her, that they would be greeted and would greet these people in Rome in a way that was befitting a Christian fellowship. There are 5 things in this which Dr. Jeremiah in his study in Romans has pointed out, and I want to mention them here because this verse, these verses, this chapter is often not mentioned much in churches, but there are 5 things in these few verses which are important to note. First of all, it was the importance of women in the early church. Many of the people mentioned here are women, And women did a great deal of work and labor in the early church. They did not do the preaching, but they did a lot of work behind the scenes. They did a lot of work in ministry to the poor, in ministering in many ways, and helping set up the communion services. They just did a lot of behind the scenes and needed work in the church, and women were much appreciated in the church, much more so than they were in the pagan churches or pagan temples that also existed at that time. In the Jewish temple, in the Jewish society, women were treated more as property than as actual people, and this is to show that in the Christian churches that were developing, women were an important part. They were an important adjunct, an important addition to church life. So many women are mentioned here, and this is one of the reasons which is important to note this, that women were an important part of the church. They were prominent. And then there was, the church had a great place in the home. The home churches were what were available in those days. And it says in the verse, in verse 5, greet the church that is in their home. And many churches were in homes in those days. There were no great big buildings or sanctuaries or huge edifices as we have today, but the churches were in the home. And the home was an important place. There was a place of the home in the church life. So women had a high position. The home had a high position as well. It is noted through these verses the priority of service in the church. Many people, it says, were mentioned because they gave service to the church. They labored much. Greet Mary, who labored much for us. Greet those of the household. Greet of those who are in the household of Narcissus, people who labored for the church. Work in the church was important. Even though they were small, the churches were small and probably did not have a lot of people individually, but there was still a lot of work to be done. And the churches were committed then to a lot of the social work, which now has been taken over by the government. But in those days, there was no government social work, and the churches did most of it. And these people labored in the church. So there was a priority of service in the church in those days. There was also a place for encouragement. A lot of these people are mentioned in a way in which would give them encouragement, and would be, in a sense, an encouragement to others. Because people liked, even if they're doing what they consider to be a lower task, they want to be recognized and noted for it. And therefore, there was a place for encouragement for these people. And it says here that Paul gives thanks to many people. They were beloved. They were service to him. And he was called his fellow worker, Stachys, my beloved. And words of encouragement, which perhaps we should be more aware of even today. And then there was the place that this was a unity. These people who came from different backgrounds, some were slaves according to their names, some were high up in the Roman hierarchy. They were associated with the highest members of the Roman elite. Some were fairly wealthy. Phoebe was apparently a wealthy woman. Some were fairly poor, but there was a sense of unity among all of them. There wasn't evidence of quibbling over minor things, but there was a sense that all these people worked together for the purpose and for the good of Christ. So this section is more of a personal ending of Paul, of his epistle, and a personal note of these people with whom and to whom he had worked. So this ends with these 5. Notice the priority of the priority and the prominence of women, the place of the house, the priority of service, which we all need still today, the place of encouragement in the church members and in the church body, and the need and the praise of unity within the church body as well. So this is the end of this lesson. We'll get on to the next lesson next week. We have 2 more lessons left in this book of Romans before we finish it after over a year's journey through it. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next week for the second last lesson in this most important book. Bye for now.